So we're going to finish up this first chapter now, even cutting out, the huge part of it there. It still went over. So anyway, what we're moving on to now, after we had just talked about how the U.S. had been the most egalitarian or equal income of all the industrialized nations in 1920, but now we're not by a long shot. In fact, I think we have the highest inequality, as I recall, of all the others. So let's look at wealth inequality. And if you look at that figure 1.9 in your textbook, it's called the champagne glass of world economic distribution. Okay. So one of the things that's important to understand here is the difference between wealth and income. Okay. Income is basically, most of us think about it as our paychecks, right? It's the money that comes in. And for many Americans, that's it. That's all you have. If you don't own a home, and that's basically it. Your car would, if it's paid off, would be considered wealth, but that's minimal, right? Unless you're very, very wealthy, once again, and then you have property anyway. So that's the difference. Wealth, when we start talking about wealth as opposed to income here in a bit, we're starting out with income. What we're referring to is everything that someone owns, property, houses, yachts, jewelry, all that kind of thing. Okay, income is just the cash, basically, the income flow that comes in. Okay, so looking at income, the 400 richest people in the United States is going to boggle your mind. And in another chapter that is all about money, I'm going to put up a global inequality chart for you so you can see in the U.S. And I'm sorry, not a global inequality chart, a U.S. inequality chart. And you will see this in a different format. So the 400 richest people in the U.S. have a combined wealth of 2.96, almost 3 trillion as of 2019. That's more than the combined wealth of the nearly the poorest, which is 2/3 of the United States, or 64% of the United States, the people in the United States. So you can think about it as 2/3 or 64%. And I'm not quite sure about this figure because 2/3 is not 64%, but that's what the text says. So either way, it's a huge amount of money when you think of 400 people, out of 300 million, which is what the U.S. has, and 2/3 of them, they have as much money as the 2/3 of that rest of that population. So the U.S. wealth inequality is also the highest racialized, is very highly racialized. The median black household has 12% as much wealth as the median white household. Now, that's up from previous years. When I was teaching this years ago in sociology, it was 8% was what the black median in wealth was. Today it's 12%, and that's 15% for $50,000 for black families compared to 140,000. These are averages for white families. So that's wealth inequality, racial wealth inequality. The global figures, of course, show the same pattern of extreme wealth concentration. So incredibly, as of 2019, 26 billionaires in the world, their wealth totals 1.4 trillion, the same as the world's poorest half. Now, let's look at consumption inequality. Well, it's a no-brainer, right? I mean, if the wealth inequality is that great, then obviously the consumption inequality is going to be enormous as well, and it is. For example, the average person in rich countries consumes 3 times, that's us, we're in a rich country, right? Consumes 3 times as much grain, fish, fresh water, and 6 times as much meat, 10 times as much energy and timber, 13 times as much iron and steel, and 14 times as much paper as the average resident of poor countries. There's an equally significant pollution gap as well. So wealthy countries create far more pollution, as you might imagine, per capita, than do poor countries. So the global top global contributors to carbon dioxide, for example, there's an emissions figure on page 110, and it's easier to see it that way for sure than it is to see it, in most of the other ways that you can see it. Let me put this on pause. All right. So where were we? Oh, yes. All those things that are consumed at so much greater amounts than, the wealthy countries consume than the poor countries. So there's, as we were talking about, the pollution gap at this point was the chart of the carbon emissions. And you can really see it listed clearly there. It's an interesting chart to look at. China produces more total pollution than the US, but the US is the next highest. So the food gap is even worse, and that's really a sad thing. So even before COVID, and it's much higher now, um, there were 41 countries that were in need of additional food aid that didn't have enough food for their whole population. And those were mostly in Africa and Asia. So let's look at health and inequality, because this is something people don't think about a lot. But we've seen an example of this with COVID, haven't we? Yes, we have. It's usually poor people and certainly people of color who have much higher rates of COVID. And that has so much to do with the healthcare system and access to healthcare and access to quality food, uh, levels of stress, and a whole variety of other things. So let's health and inequality now. So in 2014, 30% of the world's urban population lives in slums. That's over 1 billion people. So, and as you know, we don't have to think about it that much here, but sanitation is absolutely crucial to health. There are at least 2 billion people in the world who have no access to toilets or latrines, and that can create contaminated drinking water. And in addition to that, and because of the contaminated drinking and groundwater, and a variety of other things, there are 500,000 children under age 5 die of diarrheal diseases each year. But those are problems of scarcity, of not having enough of things. You can also have too much of a good thing, and I was so glad that they put this in the text to see this issue. So worldwide right now, while we're looking at 41 countries without enough food to feed their people, 2 billion people with no access to toilets and latrines, here's the too much of a good thing. And you're probably well aware of this, or aware of much of it. So worldwide, 39% of adults are overweight. Let's just round that up to 40. We're getting close to half, right? That's worldwide. 2 billion people in all. About 650 billion are obese. That's 13% of adults. And it's, of course, as you would imagine, most severe in wealthy countries. And the US is the highest, of course. 72% of all adults are overweight, 40% were obese, and that was in 2016. It's worse today. And it's nearly quadrupled since 1962. Think about that. It's almost quadrupled overweight and obesity since 1962. That is not that many generations. So undernutrition and overnutrition can exist side by side in the same population, look at the US, and across life course in the same person. Okay, and epidemiologists call that the double burden of malnutrition. let me point something out to you that most people don't seem to understand. You can be, and actually usually are, malnourished if you're obese or extremely or overweight. Um, that's not true of people who have access to very high quality food who are overweight or obese, but in generally, that's not most of the population that has those problems. So that you could put down to, soft drinks and fast food and frozen food and a variety of other things that I'm sure you're familiar with. Um, so that those people as well is the point of this book are at the affect of a industrially based food system that is not healthy, right? And this whole environmental community thing is about all spiritual, mental, physical, psychological health. Okay. Well, that's not the only thing it's about, but that's an important aspect for the human population, are those four components of health. So, and I'm sure you're familiar with food deserts, and this is why there is so much obesity among uh, Black and people of color communities, is because there are often no grocery stores that have fresh fruits and vegetables. And I remember I was on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation many, 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 many years ago, and I was just this was in the only larger city on the reservation or town, and there were hardly any fruits or vegetables, and what there were was like a really old, awful head of lettuce completely wrapped up in plastic that cost 3 times as much as it would in a regular grocery store, in a regular community. And that's an example of food deserts. Inner cities and barrios often don't have a big Safeway or Fred Meyer or something there. And so people depend on convenience stores and little neighborhood stores that are primarily packaged or frozen foods. So the other thing to point out, so is simply that there's needs to be knowledge about food. There didn't used to need to be, but there does now, about the types of food and what's best for you and that type of thing. So if you look at this next session is called Environmental Justice for Everybody. Okay? So you don't have to be poor or a person of color to live in a social space with environmental justice. That's one of the things they're talking about here. And they talk about Bill Moyers. I don't know if you know Bill Moyers. He's a very well-known journalist and had a TV show on national on PBS for years and years and years. So in 2003, he and 9 other people, these were all upper middle class people, lots of money, highly educated, etc. They let Mount Sinai Hospital in New York do blood work and check for traces of industrial chemicals and pollutants in their body. And guess what? They all had them, right? These are not poor people, okay? These are very elite people, highly educated people, wealthy people, etc., etc. Okay, they had traces. So we're going back to the intro to this section. You don't have to be poor or a person of color to suffer environmental justice, because justice would be, remember, distribution of a harm is no justice. If it's harmful, equal distribution isn't justice. Because if the thing that's being equally distributed is harmful, like toxic chemicals, well then that doesn't uh, that doesn't meet the standards of environmental justice. So now here's the key: no matter how socially advantaged you are, you can't escape the body burden of industrialism, of industrialization. And that is so, so true. I mentioned breast milk, for example. That's one very sad example of, I don't think they found anybody that they tested that didn't have some pretty bad stuff chemicals. Okay, environmental justice across species. Now, this is something that people don't think about enough, I don't think, because we have enough problem with ourselves and all the health issues and cancer and et cetera that we just talked about. But one of the ways to change the ideology about this, about endangered species, is that having saving endangered species or not having them become endangered benefits us as well. It benefits us, of course, in terms of the health of our planet, but there are, and bees are a perfect example of that, okay? You know, some people I've heard say that it's just silly, all the brouhaha about disappearing bees and die off of bees. Well, it's not silly because without bees, there is no pollination, right? So, I mean, there's different varieties of bees, that's for sure, but they're all having, issues, and there's been huge die-offs because of herbicides and pesticides. So, does it benefit us to be sure that bees survive? Yes, it does. It also benefits us in ways that are not just uh, material survival, and that's one of the key points in this class is to understand the harmony and the beauty of how all of it works. I get such joy out of seeing the amazing butterflies that come to my flower garden at certain times of the year. And I was thinking the other day, and they do pollination too. And then the hummingbirds, and you think, what if they were gone? It would just be awful if they were gone. So that's one of the things to really think about. I love this quote. Hold on a minute here. by one of the most famous lines by Adolf Leopold, as they talk about in your book, one of the founding fathers of environmental sociology. So here's his quote: "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise." Well, that's a pretty simple ruler, right? That's a pretty simple way to discover if something's right or wrong, good or bad, in terms of the environment and ecology. And I love, he refers to this sense of a biotic community, a sense of ecos, which is the root for home. The planet is our home. It's where we live. And and it's also the habitat we share with many others. And indigenous people intuitively knew about that relationship. Scientists in our time have discovered how all those things work together. We'll talk about forests and fungi a little bit later in the class. It's just amazing. That's some of the most current research that's going on about the rivers of mycorrhizal fungi that connect trees and how they communicate with each other underground about that. And this isn't woo-woo stuff. This is scientists. And so, we can intuit that, as people have ever since there have been people, about the environment. But now we know it's really true. So that biotic community, that home that we live in, the habitat we share with others. And one of the things that this Adolf Leopold quote that I just gave you, and that's in the text, the word beauty is in there. And that's, something that is very, very powerful about nature. And I would like you to go back and look at the opening page photograph. I spent a long time looking. All my online classes have images on the opening page that I work hard to find, and that means something in relationship to whatever the course is, and hopefully it makes students feel happy when they open the page. That photograph, after looking at, you can Google images of trees or something of that nature, and Google images, and you'll get a hit that says 10,000 pictures of trees and 4,000 pictures of trees, or the one said the 700 best photos of trees. Well, I didn't have time to go through 4,000 or 5,000 or 700 or whatever, but I was lucky on the ninth or 10th page of images of trees, many of which were very beautiful, to find that one. And that one just, I certainly respond to that photo and the light and that type of thing. And I hope you do too. If you can't get out in the real nature, and I hope you can, maybe there's some way to click on it and enlarge it and get into that photo, because it's really something. So that photo to me epitomizes what Leopold is talking about in terms of the beauty and the importance of recognizing and acknowledging that. So there's, the other thing here now is we're talking about the whole community. So the decline and loss of species is a huge issue. And birds is the one that they bring up, birds, in the book. And why are birds dying up? Well, aside from the ones who can't eat because of the pull-off tabs from cans, which isn't that isn't a massive amount that die off. It's due to the die off of insects. Insect Armageddon, right? So if you're spraying all this stuff to kill insects, well, yeah, you kill insects, but you also kill the things that live on the insects. Same thing's happening, in coral reefs and in the oceans. There's food chain, as you know. So that's part of what's going on there. With decline and loss of species comes the threat of extinction, which is happening with polar bears right now. And elephants. Two of my favorite critters. Polar bears due to global warming, elephants due primarily to hunting and tusk, ivory trade, et cetera. I'm sure you've seen those ads on or those commercials or pleas for help on screen about that. So those are pretty powerful things, Those are do animals go extinct? Sure. The dinosaurs are the perfect example of that. Although we have remnants of them in birds and other reptiles, but yeah, it's pretty intense right now because it's happening so quickly that there's very little opportunity to stop it. So Richard Leakey, a very famous anthropologist, did some research. This is in your text in a little more detail, but basically he said we could lose as many as 50% of the species in the next 100 years. And there's a figure, 1.12, that talks about that. And then, of course, there's loss of landscape. I don't know if any of you travel north or south on Interstate 5, but all of the big mountains, Shasta, Mount Hood is what I particularly notice. And of course, some of the other, Mount St. Helens, the snow is gone from the peaks, or it's much smaller in the winter than it used to be. Covers a much less of an area of the mountain than it used to. So we can see this loss of landscape with our own eyes in terms of that. Certainly the news about the forests that's in your book is not good. Earth has lost nearly a third of the original area of forest land. The forest cover has decreased from 45% of the surface to 31% in 2015. Between 1990 and 2015, 7.6 million hectares were logged. Now, a hectare is almost 2 acres, so you can double that figure pretty much, the 7.6 million. And then, of course, the ice caps, we talked about that. But now, let's get to some other stuff, because this is what I think is really interesting, and I'm so pleased that the book the authors put this next concept here: loss of intimacy. So, the disappearance of quiet intimacy with the earth. Okay. As we know, modern technology removes a sense of the quiet intimacy from the greater, and I like this terminology too, the more real reality. Technology is not real reality. You seeing me this way is not really seeing me, is it? Uh, it's great we can do it in situations where we need to, but it ain't the same thing. Okay. That picture on the opening page that I just asked you to really look at isn't the same as being with a tree somewhere out in the woods, right? Or somewhere else at the beach, wherever, whatever you like, whatever you relate to, respond to. So that's a really important thing, to make the distinction between real reality and pseudo reality. We get fooled by that because there's so much pseudo reality around. There can be physical and mental repercussions from only dealing with pseudo reality. I'll tell you that. And there's a wonderful thing. I'll put something up for you, probably not this week, but because there's so much for you to absorb this week. But check it out yourself. It's called forest bathing, if you haven't heard about it. And it's just what it sounds like. Forest bathing is going into the forest, and it's something that really changes people's attitudes around and just being in the forest, letting the energy of the forest and the environment of the forest, the ecology, the ecos, just be with you and you with it. And it calms people down. It makes them feel more hopeful. It does all kinds of things. It has physical uh, benefits to your body as well in terms of respiration and heart rate and all of that. So you can check that out. So now we're going to move to some of the good news. I know this has been extremely and probably will continue to be disturbing. And I hope what I always say: get mad, not sad. Okay. Now, I don't mean by getting mad to go out and do something crazy. What I mean is find a way to use the energy of that kind of righteous anger at what's going on. And once again, most of you, not all of you, but most of you are fairly young, I'm sure. And you didn't do this, right? You have to reap the consequences of it. Certainly the deadlines, 2050, that type of thing is going to come to you, not to me. So hopefully there's some kind of, and I hate to use the term righteous, but righteous anger there, that you can take the energy of that and think about a way to utilize it. Because the sadness of it, the overwhelmingness of it, can do just the opposite, right? It can make us throw up our hands and give up and become incredibly depressed. And I don't want you to do that. I want you to know that there are actions you can take. There really are, from tiny to large. Okay. So that's an important thing to remember as we go through this. And there now we're moving into in the end of the text here. We're almost done. I thought this was going to be 10 or 15 minutes, and it's half an hour. The social construction of environmental problems and solutions. So here's the good news. So the key point is this social construction of reality again, right? That the very things that lead to us sidelining or ignoring environmental concerns and actions are the same things that can lead to environmental solutions. And that's the social, they use the word constitution. I like construction, but the social constitution of everyday life. What do we do every day? Okay. So and what that means is the social constitution of everyday life. How do we institute motivation and structures and patterns in our days that enable us to make some positive actions around this? Okay. To do that, they have to be convenient. They have to be sensible. They have to be pretty easy. Uh, so we can remake the way we do things personally and as a society, right? Uh, into the and to use the new terminology that they're going to use throughout the text now. I love this normal environmentalism. You don't have to think about it, right? You don't have to think about putting your plastic bags into one bag and taking them to the grocery store and sticking them in wherever the recycling thing is. I mean, that's not a big deal. It's not hard to do. It's not a no-brainer, you know. Uh, Campus has all kinds of recycling stuff now, as you know. They're listed. There's for paper, there's for cans, there's for this, there's for that. Batteries and cell phones now can be recycled. The bookstore has a station to do that, and there's others, and it's a whole city. I can't remember if it's city or county wide. Uh, I think it's an organization that's doing both Coos Bay and North Bend. There didn't used to be anywhere to get rid of batteries. That's horrible that there was nowhere. It would drive me crazy. We still drive to Eugene to recycle, computers and, a variety of other things that are electronic because there's not a place here yet to do that. But it's happening. And it's easy if it's in the grocery store, if it's in school where you go, or the Coosehead Food Store has the battery recycling stuff too. So it's where you already are in your pathways. That's called normal environmentalism. Remember, the personal is political. It's a political act to not throw away plastic in the regular garbage, and that type of thing. China stopped taking most of America's plastic recycling because Americans were too lazy to do it the way they needed it to be done, to take the paper off any piece of plastic that you put, that is being recycled, et cetera, et cetera. They just said, forget it. They're not taking it anymore. So the normal environmentalism is environmentalism. You don't have to worry about it. It just becomes the normal thing to do because the structure is already there. And that's what I was giving you, some of those ideas of structures. Okay, now bringing your own bags to the grocery store. There's another example. That changed in the last couple of years, didn't it? Where they're now charging you for bags. You want a bag, you pay for it because it's so easy to bring one and just keep using it over and over and over again, okay? So there's other things that you can do, like walking when you can walk. I know this is difficult around here, but if you're in a city, um, if you look at travelogues or films of many European cities, particularly Scandinavian and particularly Holland, everybody's on a bike. Now, once again, our structure in America is set up for cars, not for walking, not for bikes. And depending on where you live, it's not really practical to walk that much in, rural Oregon. But in Portland or Eugene, yeah, it is, particularly Portland. So there are those types of things. There's all kinds of different ways of, I don't know, most of you probably aren't into, buying construction materials right now and stuff, but those are things one can think about if one is, or buying new appliances. You get a tax break for buying energy saving refrigerators and washing machines and that type of thing. Now, that's normal environmentalism that's being built in to the system. So buying sustainably grown food, where workers are paid well, field workers, and not poisoned by herbicides and pesticides, which then you're also getting when you buy the food. That's crucially important. And I want to say something about food, which is people complain about how expensive organic food is. Well, how expensive are the consequences of eating food that is not organically grown? You have to think about that. It's called amortizing. Eat less of something else that you don't need that much of, like meat, for example. We eat 6 times as much meat as people in many other countries, okay? The meat consumption, okay? And you know that that's not necessary. You don't have to have meat at every meal. And that means you can buy high quality fruit and vegetables, which is going to make you healthier. I'm not saying don't eat meat at all. Don't misunderstand me here. I'm talking about making these kinds of things that become part of your normal environmentalism and can be normal health behaviors as well. So what that normal environmentalism means, one more time, is making things easy. Okay, that's sometimes hard to do, right? It's sometimes hard to make things easy. For one thing, we have to change habit patterns. I cannot tell you how many times I forgot my bag when we started taking our own bags into grocery stores. And I'd either, depending on how tired I was, I'd pay them 5 cents, or I'd go back out to the car and get my. But now it's just second nature. I don't even think about it. I'm sure for people who litter and drop things, that would be one of the major, huge changes people could make. It's rewiring your brain. It really is. I realized that when I would forget the bags. It's rewiring your brain, and then it becomes easy once you do that. It's a little bit of effort. That's why I said it's not always. It's sometimes hard to make things easy, but it's mostly just initially that occurs. Uh, because we not only have to have the opportunities and the structure there, we have to actually do it, of course. So, but we've already, as I said, there's so many systems already in place. There need to be more, but we're doing it. We're working on it. So that's it for this week. Okay, see you next week.